3 weeks before my wedding, I found out my fiancé had been sleeping with another man for over a year. I didn't scream. I didn't cancel anything. I smiled, finished planning the seating chart, and added one more name to the guest list, his. Everyone thought I was the happiest groom in the world. Only I knew that the wedding I was building wasn't a celebration. It was a trap. And on the day she said I do, the truth was going to walk through the door wearing a suit and holding a gift. My name is Daniel Weiss. I was 29 years old, working as a structural engineer in a mid-sized firm, living a life that felt, on paper, almost perfect. 4 years earlier, I met a woman named Ines Duart at a mutual friend's birthday party. She was training to become a physical therapist, sharp-tongued, funny in a way that caught you off guard, and she had this habit of remembering small details about people. Your coffee order, your mother's name, the show you mentioned once in passing. I fell for her within a month. We moved in together after a year. She met my parents in Germany. I met hers in Portugal. Our families got along in that easy, relieved way families do when they sense their kids picked well. When I proposed at a lookout point above the coast during a trip to Lisbon, she cried so hard she couldn't speak for almost a minute. I remember thinking, in that exact moment, that I had never been more certain of anything. The wedding planning started almost immediately. We picked a venue, an old renovated vineyard estate about an hour outside the city, and set a date 14 months out. Ines threw herself into the details with an intensity that impressed everyone around her. Flowers, seating charts, the band, the menu. She had opinions on all of it, and I was happy to let her run the show while I handled logistics and the guest list on my side. One name that came up early, and often, was Rafael Castillo. Rafael was a colleague of Ines's from the clinic where she did her residency rotations, a physiotherapist a few years older than her, recently divorced. She talked about him the way you talk about a work friend, casually, in passing, usually attached to a story about a difficult patient, or an office argument over scheduling. I met him twice at group dinners. He was likable, easy to talk to, the kind of guy who remembers to ask about your job the next time he sees you. I had no reason to think twice about him. Looking back, that's the detail that still sits heavy in my chest. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't hidden. He was already inside the circle, already trusted, already invited to the small gatherings where trust gets built without anyone noticing. And somewhere in that comfortable familiarity, something started that I had absolutely no idea was happening. For the first 10 months of engagement, life moved forward exactly the way it's supposed to. We toured venues on weekends, argued lightly over cake flavors, sent save the dates. Ines started picking up more shifts at a second clinic to help cover wedding costs, which meant longer hours and later nights. I didn't think anything of it. I was working long hours too. We were a couple building towards something, and exhaustion felt like a normal price to pay. The shift was so gradual that I couldn't have told you the exact week it started. Ines began coming home later, sometimes past 11, always with a reasonable explanation. A patient ran long. A colleague needed help closing up. Traffic near the second clinic was worse than usual. None of it, on its own, raised a flag. People who work in healthcare have unpredictable schedules. I told myself that constantly. What did change slowly was how she used her phone. She had never been secretive before. For most of our relationship, her phone sat face up on the counter, unlocked half the time, and I could glance at her text notification without her caring even slightly. Somewhere around month 11 of the engagement, that changed. She started taking her phone into the bathroom when she showered. She started sleeping with it face down on her nightstand, something she'd never done. Once, when it buzzed on the kitchen table while she was in the other room, I saw her walk quickly to check it, then relax visibly when she saw whatever it was. I brought it up once gently, framing it as a joke. "You're very protective of that phone lately." She laughed it off, said something about work group chats being chaotic and embarrassing, and the conversation moved on. I let it go because I wanted to let it go. When you're planning a wedding, when you've built 4 years with someone, your brain does everything it can to protect the story you've already decided is true. The wedding planning itself became a strange pressure point. Ines started snapping at small things, a caterer's response time, a bridesmaid's dress color, in a way that felt disproportionate to the actual problem. She'd apologize afterward, blame stress, blame exhaustion from working 2 jobs. I absorbed it. I told myself that brides get overwhelmed, that this was a temporary season, that once the wedding was over, we'd go back to normal. Physically, things cooled too, in a way I chalked up to fatigue. We went from a couple that touched constantly, a hand on the back, a kiss goodbye that lingered, to something quieter, more functional. I noticed it, filed it away as wedding stress, and kept moving forward, because the alternative explanation wasn't one I was ready to consider. Then came the weekend trip. Ionese told me she and 2 co-workers were driving out to a spa town for a girls' recharge weekend before the final wedding push. She showed me photos afterward. A hotel room, a pool, a group dinner. I complimented the photos and thought nothing more of it. It wasn't until almost 2 months later, in a conversation I'll get to, that I learned Raphael had a property 20 minutes from that exact spa town, and that his name appeared on a car rental record for those same 3 days. The first real crack came from my sister, Marlene. We were having lunch about 10 weeks before the wedding when she asked, almost too casually, whether Ionese and Raphael had always been that close. I asked what she meant. Marlene said she'd seen them at a CF downtown a few weeks earlier, sitting across from each other, heads close together, laughing in a way that struck her as more familiar than a simple co-worker friendship. She said she almost said hello, but something about the energy at the table made her hesitate and just keep walking. I defended it immediately. I told her Raphael and Ionese worked together, that they probably had things to discuss, that Marlene was reading too much into body language from across the street. My sister didn't push back hard. She just said, "I'm only telling you what I saw," and let it drop. But the seed was planted, and once it's planted, it doesn't leave. I started paying closer attention, almost against my will. I noticed how often Raphael's name came up in Einz's stories now, more than any other co-worker, by a wide margin. I noticed that when his name was mentioned, she'd sometimes glance at me quickly afterward, like she was checking my reaction, before continuing. I noticed that her phone, which used to sit anywhere in the house, now traveled with her from room to room. One evening, she left her phone on the couch while she went to take a call in the bedroom. The same call, I'd later learn, that she often stepped away for. I didn't touch it. I told myself I wasn't the kind of person who checks a partner's phone. I still believed that about myself in general, but I also know now that belief was partly self-protection. If I didn't look, I didn't have to know. A close friend of mine, Jonas, who had also met Raphael a few times, mentioned something similar to what my sister said. Unprompted, a few weeks later, he said Raphael had asked him, almost directly, what my work schedule looked like for the coming month. Jonas thought it was an odd question from someone who was, as far as he understood, just a work friend of the bride's. He mentioned it to me as a passing comment, not knowing the weight it would carry. By this point, 3 separate threads, my sister's observation, the phone behavior, and now this, had converged into something I could no longer dismiss as coincidence. I didn't have proof of anything. What I had was a feeling, cold and persistent, sitting in my chest every time Ionese said Raphael's name. I decided quietly that I needed to know the truth before I said vows I couldn't take back. I didn't go looking for a confrontation right away. I went looking for facts. The first thing I did was pull our shared calendar and cross-reference it against the credit card statements for the household account, which Ionese and I both had access to for wedding expenses. That's where I found the car rental charge from the spa weekend. A separate car, rented under Raphael's name, picked up from a location 20 minutes from the hotel where Ionese said she'd stayed with her co-workers. I didn't say anything yet. I wanted more than one data point before I let myself believe it. So I did something I'm not proud of, but I don't regret. I checked the location history on our shared family map app, which we'd both turned on years earlier so we could find each other's phones if they were lost. Einz's location for 3 separate late shift nights over the past 6 weeks didn't match either clinic she worked at. Instead, it placed her at an address about 15 minutes from our apartment, an address I looked up and found belonged to a small rental unit, leased, according to public records I could access, under Raphael Castillo's name. That was the night everything changed for me internally, even though nothing had changed on the surface yet. I sat in my car outside our building for almost an hour before going inside, trying to figure out what kind of man I wanted to be in response to this. My first instinct was fury, the kind that wants to kick down a door and scream until something breaks. But underneath that instinct was something colder and more deliberate. I thought about the 14 months of planning, the deposits already paid, the families already booked flights, the story everyone believed they were about to watch unfold. And I thought, if she wants to stand in front of everyone and lie, she should have to do it in front of the one person who knows the truth. Over the next 2 weeks, I gathered more. I hired a discreet private investigator, something I'd never imagined myself doing, who confirmed what the location data suggested. Ionese had been meeting Raphael at that rental apartment consistently, at least twice a week, for what appeared to be well over a year, going back to before our engagement. The investigator provided time-stamped photos. Ioannis arriving, Raphael arriving 15 minutes later, the two of them leaving separately hours after that. I sat with that information for 3 full days before deciding what to do with it. I didn't tell my sister. I didn't tell Jonas. I told no one. Ioannis, meanwhile, continued behaving exactly as she had for months, affectionate in short bursts, distracted the rest of the time, deep in wedding logistics, completely unaware that the man across from her at dinner already knew everything. I remember watching her laugh at something on her phone one night and feeling a strange, hollow calm settle over me. The anger hadn't left. It had just changed shape into something more patient. 2 weeks before the wedding, I had the final piece I needed. A recorded phone call the investigator had legally captured audio, commissioned for in our state, in which Raphael, speaking to Ioannis on a call she took from her car, said something that removed any remaining doubt. He told her he didn't understand why she was still going through with this, referring to the wedding, and that he thought she should just tell Daniel and end it properly instead of dragging it out. Heinz's response, quiet and clearly frustrated, was that it was too late to stop everything now, and that she just needed to get through the wedding first. Hearing that sentence broke something in me that I don't think fully healed for months afterward. It wasn't just that she cheated, it was that she knew, with full clarity, that she didn't want to marry me, and had decided to go through with it anyway because stopping felt more inconvenient than continuing to lie. 14 months of planning, 200 guests, both of our families flying in from 3 different countries, all of it, apparently, less important to stop than the discomfort of an honest conversation. I didn't confront her that night. I sat with the recording, playing it back more times than I probably should have, feeling the anger settle into something colder and more focused. I thought about calling off the wedding quietly, disappearing to another city, letting the whole thing collapse without explanation. Part of me wanted that, the clean exit, the version where I never had to look either of them in the eye again. But another part of me, the part that had spent 2 weeks gathering evidence, instead of confronting her immediately, wanted something else. I wanted her to understand, in front of the people whose opinions she cared about most, that her lie hadn't worked. I wanted Raphael, who had spent over a year in the comfortable position of the secret, to feel what it was like to be seen. I decided the wedding would still happen, but not as the wedding either of them expected. I called the venue and, using the flexibility in the contract we'd already paid for, made 2 changes that seemed unremarkable on their own. First, I surprised Ioannis by adding a handful of names to the guest list as a romantic gesture. People from her work she'd mentioned, wanting to invite, but had left off due to budget concerns. Raphael's name went on that list. Second, I arranged, quietly, with the venue's events coordinator, for a short video segment to play during the reception. Something I framed as a surprise tribute to our relationship, put together from years of photos and messages. Ioannis was thrilled by both gestures. She had no idea what either one actually contained. The wedding day arrived exactly as planned on paper. 210 guests. A ceremony under the vineyard's restored stone archway. Ioannis in a dress she'd been altering for months, walking down the aisle toward me with an expression I now recognize, in hindsight, as relief rather than joy. Relief that she made it to the day without the truth catching up to her. I said my vows. She said hers. Somewhere in the crowd, seated at a table near the back, exactly where the seating chart placed him, sat Raphael Castillo, dressed in a dark suit, smiling and clapping along with everyone else, believing he was simply an invited guest enjoying a colleague's wedding. The reception moved through dinner normally. Toasts were given, my best man, her maid of honor, her father, all warm and unaware. Then the events coordinator signaled to me that it was time for the surprise video. Ioannis squeezed my hand under the table, excited, thinking she was about to watch a montage of our relationship. The lights dimmed. The screen came on. What played instead was a compilation the investigator had helped me assemble, carefully edited to be undeniable without being needlessly cruel. Time-stamped photos of Ioannis and Raphael arriving, separately at the same address over the course of months, followed by the final piece, audio of the phone call. Raphael's voice clearly saying he didn't understand why she was still going through with this, and Heinz's voice replying that she needed to get through the wedding first. The room went silent in a way I have never experienced before or since. 200 people, mid-chew, mid-laugh, frozen. I stood up, took the microphone from the DJ table, and said the only thing I'd rehearsed. I wanted everyone here to see the truth before we started this marriage on a lie. Ioannis, I know I've known for weeks. And Raphael, thank you for coming. I thought you'd want to hear that recording again, since you clearly didn't believe she'd go through with it either. Ionese was crying, standing, trying to grab the microphone from me, saying my name over and over. Raphael sat frozen at his table as every head in the room turned toward him. Her father stood up so fast his chair fell backward. My mother had her hand over her mouth. It was, without question, the loudest silence I have ever heard a room produce. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The recording had already said everything that needed saying, in both of their own voices, in a room full of the exact people whose respect they'd both been counting on to survive this unnoticed. I set the microphone down, walked over to the head table, and picked up the folder the investigator had prepared as backup, printed photos, timestamps, the rental agreement under Raphael's name, and placed it in front of Einz's father, who had flown in from Lisbon 3 days earlier fully believing he was walking his daughter into a happy marriage. Raphael tried to leave quietly through the side exit near the bar. He didn't make it far. Einz's own cousin, a broad-shouldered man named Thiago, who had apparently liked Raphael well enough at the rehearsal dinner, stepped in front of him and asked, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, whether he had anything he wanted to say to the room before he left. Raphael said nothing. He left through the parking lot to a chorus of stairs he will likely remember for the rest of his life. I turned to Ionese, who was still holding onto the idea. I think that she could talk her way out of it in front of everyone, the way she talked her way through the last year. I told her, calmly, that I wasn't angry anymore, that the anger had burned off 2 weeks ago in a parked car outside our apartment, and what was left now was just clarity. I told her the marriage certificate on the table by the gift table was still unsigned, and it was going to stay that way. I asked the DJ to put music back on. It felt important, in that moment, not to let the night collapse into chaos, but to reclaim it, to show everyone in that room, including myself, that I was not the wreckage in this story. Some guests left immediately, uncomfortable and unsure what etiquette applied. Most stayed, my side of the family, and to my surprise a good portion of hers, gathered around me for the rest of the night in a strange, improvised show of support that felt more real than any toast that had been planned. Ionese left the venue about 20 minutes later with her mother, still in her wedding dress, still crying, past a crowd of guests who no longer looked at her with the warmth they had 2 hours earlier. I stayed until the very end of the reception, danced with my sister, ate the untouched wedding cake with my closest friends at midnight, and went home to an apartment that, for the first time in weeks, felt entirely honest. The weeks that followed were, unsurprisingly, complicated. Ionese tried to reach me several times. Calls, messages, one attempt to show up at my apartment that my sister intercepted before I even knew about it. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said. In her own recorded voice, in front of 200 witnesses. We split the apartment lease through a lawyer within a month. She moved back in with her parents in Portugal for a period, according to mutual friends, and eventually relocated to a different city entirely, apparently unable to face the social fallout in ours. Raphael's professional reputation took a real hit. The clinic where he and Ionese had both worked was small enough that word spread within days, and while nothing about the affair was illegal, several colleagues reportedly made clear they no longer wanted to work alongside him. He left the practice within 2 months and, as far as I know, hasn't resurfaced in the same professional circles since. My own family, especially my mother, worried for a while that I'd made a public spectacle I would come to regret. That humiliating to people, however deserved, wasn't the same as healing. I understood the concern, but I didn't feel regret. What I felt, more than anything, was relief that I hadn't found out 3 years into a marriage, with a mortgage and maybe a child between us, instead of on a single, very expensive afternoon. Financially, the wedding cost me nearly everything I'd saved for it, since most vendor deposits were non-refundable regardless of circumstances. I don't consider that money wasted. I think of it, honestly, as the price of finding out the truth in a single controlled moment rather than in slow, repeated collapses over years. Some of my friends joked, not unkindly, that I'd thrown the most expensive and effective breakup event in the city's history. I've come to find that framing more accurate than tragic. It's been 8 months now. I'm not going to pretend the wound closed instantly, because it didn't. There were nights I replayed the reception in my head, wondering if I should have handled it differently, more privately, less publicly. But every time I land in the same place. I didn't create the lie. I only refused to let it finish quietly. Ioannis built a year and a half of deception around a wedding she didn't want, and Raphael was comfortable enough in the shadows to let it happen. All I did was turn the lights on, in the one room where they couldn't pretend not to be seen. I started dating again recently, cautiously, with a level of attention to small inconsistencies that I know isn't entirely healthy yet, but that I'm working on. What this experience taught me, more than anything, is that the moment you feel yourself building excuses for someone else's behavior, a hidden phone, a defensive reaction, a friend's passing comment you brush off too quickly, that feeling is data, not paranoia. Trust your gut a little sooner than I did, and you'll save yourself a great deal of pain. If you made it this far, I'd genuinely like to know what you would have done differently. Would you have confronted her the moment you found the car rental receipt, or gathered every piece of proof the way I did? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story kept you hooked from the first minute, make sure to subscribe, because there are more real stories like this one coming every week. Stories about betrayal, truth, and the moment people find the courage to stop pretending.